Back from that Bourne by Edward Page Mitchell. Practical Working of Materialization in Maine. A strange story from Pocock Island, a materialized spirit that will not go back. The first glimpse of what may yet cause very extensive trouble in the world. We are permitted to make extracts from a private letter which bears the signature of a gentleman well known in business circles, and whose veracity we have never heard called in question. Ill's statements are startling and well nigh incredible, but if true, they are susceptible of easy verification. Yet the thoughtful mind will hesitate about accepting them without the fullest proof, for they bring upon the world a social problem of stupendous importance. The dangers apprehended by Mr. Malthus and his followers become remote and commonplace by the side of this new and terrible issue. The letter is dated at Pocock Island, a small township in Washington County, Maine, about 17 miles from the mainland, and nearly midway between Mount Desert and the Grand Marion. The last state census accords to Pocock Island a population of 311, mostly engaged in the porgy fisheries. At the presidential election of 1872, the island gave Grant a majority of 3. These two facts are all that we are able to learn of the locality, from sources outside of the letter already referred to. The letter, omitting certain passages which refer solely to private matters, reads as follows. "But enough of the disagreeable business that brought me here to this bleak island in the month of November. I have a singular story to tell you. After our experience together at Chittenden, I know you will not reject statements because they are startling. My friend, there is upon Pocock Island a materialized spirit which, or who, refuses to be dematerialized. At this moment, and within a quarter of a mile from me as I write, a man who died and was buried 4 years ago, and who has exploited the mysteries beyond the grave, walks, talks, and holds intercourse with the inhabitants of the island, and is to all appearances determined to remain permanently upon this side of the river. I will relate the circumstances as briefly as I can. John Newbegin." In April 1870, John Newbegin died and was buried in the little cemetery on the landward side of the island. Newbegin was a man of about 48, without family or near connections, and eccentric to a degree that sometimes inspired questions as to his sanity. What money he had earned by many seasons fishing upon the banks was invested in quarters of 2 small mackerel schooners, the remainder of which belonged to John Hodgson, the richest man on Pocock, who was estimated by good authorities to be worth $13,000 or $14,000. Newbegin was not without a certain kind of culture. He had read a good deal of the odds and ends of literature, and as a simple-minded islander expressed it in my hearing, knew more bookfuls than anybody else on Pocock. He was naturally an intelligent man, and he might have attained influence in the community had it not been for his utter aimlessness of character, his indifference of fortune, and his consuming thirst for rum. Many yachtsmen who have had occasion to stop at Pocock for water or harbor shelter during Eastern cruises will remember a long, listless figure, astonishingly attired in blue army pants, rubber boots, loose toga made of some bright chintz material, and very bad hat, staggering through the little settlement, followed by the rabble of jeering brats, and pausing to strike uncertain blows at those within the reach of the dead sculpin which he usually carried around by the tail. This was John Newbegin. His sudden death. As I have already remarked, he died 4 years ago last April. The Mary Emmeline, one of the little schooners in which he owned, had returned from the eastward, and had smuggled, or run in, a quantity of St. John brandy. Newbegin had a solitary and protracted debauch. He was missed from his accustomed walks for several days, and when the islanders broke into the hovel where he lived, close down to the seaweed, and almost within reach of the incoming tide, they found him dead on the floor, with an emptied demijohn hard by his head. After the primitive custom of the island, they interred John Newbegin's remains without coroner's inquest, burial certificate, or funeral services, and in the excitement of a large catch of porgies that summer, soon forgot him and his friendless life. His interest in the Mary Emmeline and the putty boat recurred to John Hodgson, and as nobody came forward to demand an administration of the estate, it was never administered. The forms of the law are but loosely followed in some of these marginal localities. His reappearance at Pocock. Well, my dear, 4 years and 4 months had brought their quota of varying seasons to Pocock Island when John Newbegin reappeared under the following circumstances. In the latter part of last August, as you may remember, there was a heavy gale all along our Atlantic coast. During this storm, the squadron of the Naugatuck Yacht Club, which was returning from a summer cruise as far as Campobello, was forced to take shelter in the harbor of the leeward of Pocock Island. The gentlemen of the club spent 3 days at the little settlement ashore. Among the party was Mr. R. E. in which name you will recognize a medium of celebrity, and one who had been particularly successful in materializations. At the desire of his companions, and to relieve the tedium of their detention, Mr. E. improvised a cabinet in the little schoolhouse at Pocock, and gave a séance, to the delight of his fellow yachtsmen, and the utter bewilderment of such natives as were permitted to witness the manifestations. The conditions seemed unusually favorable to spirit appearances, and the séance was, upon the whole, perhaps the most remarkable that Mr. E. ever held. It was all the more remarkable because the surroundings were such that the prejudiced skeptic could discover no possibility of trickery. The first form to issue from the wood closet which constituted the cabinet, when Mr. E. had been tied therein by a committee of old sailors from the yachts, was that of an Indian chief who announced himself as Hockomock, and who retired after dancing a harvest moon pas seul, and declared himself, in very emphatic terms, opposed to the present Indian policy of the administration. Hockomock was succeeded by the aunt of one of the yachtsmen, who identified herself beyond question by allusion to family matters, and by displaying the scar of a burn upon her left arm, received while making tomato ketchup upon earth. Then came successively a child whom no one present recognized, a French Canadian who could not talk English, and a portly gentleman who introduced himself as William King, first governor of Maine. These in turn re-entered the cabinet, and were seen no more. It was some time before another spirit manifested itself, and Mr. E. gave directions that the light be turned down still further. Then the door of the wood closet was slowly opened, and a singular figure in rubber boots and a species of Dolly Varden garment emerged, bringing a dead fish in his right hand. His determination to remain. The city men who were present, I am told, thought that the medium was masquerading in grotesque habiliments for the more complete astonishment of the islanders, but these latter rose from their seats and exclaimed with one consent, "It is John Newbegin! It is Johnny for certain!" And then, in not unnatural terror at the apparition, they turned and fled from the schoolroom, uttering dismal cries. John Newbegin came calmly forward and turned up the solitary kerosene lamp that shed uncertain light over the proceedings. He then sat down in the teacher's chair, folded his arms, and looked complacently around him. "You might as well untie the medium," he at length remarked. "I propose to remain in the materialized condition." And he did remain. When the party left the schoolhouse, among them walked John Newbegin, as truly a being of flesh and blood as any man of them. From that day to this he has been a living inhabitant of Pocock Island, eating, drinking water only, and sleeping after the manner of men. The yachtsmen who made sail for Bar Harbor the very next morning probably believe that he was a fraud hired for the occasion by Mr. E., but the people of Pocock who laid him out dug his grave and put him into it 4 years ago, know that John Newbegin has come back to them from a land they know not of. A singular member of society. The idea of having a ghost somewhat more condensed, it is true, than the traditional ghost, as a member was not at first over-pleasing to the 311 inhabitants of Pocock Island. To this day they are a little sensitive upon the subject, feeling evidently that if the matter got abroad, it might injure the sale of the really excellent porgy oil, which is the product of their sole manufacturing interest. This reluctance to advertise the skeleton in their closet, superadded to the slowness of these obtuse, fishy, matter-of-fact people to recognize the transcendent importance of the case, must be accepted as an explanation of the fact that John Newbegin's spirit has been on earth between 3 and 4 months, and yet the singular circumstance is not known to the whole country. But the Pocockians have at last come to see that a spirit is not necessarily a malevolent spirit, and accepting his presence as fact in their stolid, unreasoning way, they are quite neighborly and sociable with Mr. Newbegin. I know that your first question will be, is there sufficient proof of his ever having been dead? To this I answer unhesitatingly yes. He was too well known a character, and too many people saw the corpse to admit of any mistake on this point. I may here add that it was at one time proposed to disinter the original remains, but the project was abandoned in deference to the wishes of Mr. Newbegin, who feels a natural delicacy about having his first set of bones disturbed from motives of mere curiosity. An interview with a dead man. You will readily believe that I took occasion to see and converse with John Newbegin. I found him affable and even communicative. He is perfectly well aware of his doubtful status as a being, but is in hopes that at some future time there may be legislation which shall correctly define his position and the position of any spirit who may follow him into the material world. The only point upon which he is reticent is his experience during the 4 years that elapsed between his death and his reappearance at Pocock. It is to be presumed that the memory is not a pleasant one. At least he never speaks of this period. He candidly admits, however, that he is glad to get back to earth, and that he embraced the very first opportunity to be materialized. Mr. Newbegin says that he is consumed with remorse for the wasted days of his previous existence. Indeed, his course during the past 3 months would show that this regret is genuine. He has discarded his eccentric costume and dresses like a reasonable spirit. He has not touched liquor since his reappearance. He has embarked in the porgy oil business, and his operations already rival those of Hodgson, his old partner in the Mary Emmeline and the Putty Boat. By the way, Newbegin threatens to sue Hodgson for his undivided quarter in each of these vessels, and this interesting case therefore bids fair to be thoroughly investigated in the courts. As a businessman, he is generally esteemed on the island, although there is a noticeable reluctance to discount his paper at long dates. In short, Mr. John Newbegin is a most respectable citizen, if a dead man can be a citizen, and has announced his intention of running for the next legislature. In conclusion, and now, my dear, I have told you the substance of all I know respecting this strange case. Yet, after all, why so strange? We accepted materialization at Chittenden. Is this any more than the logical issue of that admission? If the spirit may return to earth clothed in flesh and blood and all the physical attributes of humanity, why may it not remain on earth as long as it sees fit? Thinking of it from whatever standpoint, I cannot but regard John Newbegin as the pioneer of a possibly large immigration from the spirit world. The bars once down, a whole flock will come trooping back to earth. Death will lose its significance altogether. And when I think of the disturbance which will result in our social relations, of the overthrow of all accepted institutions, and of the nullification of all principles of political economy, law, and religion, I am lost in perplexity and apprehension. The Devil's Funeral by Edward Page Mitchell. I felt myself lifted up from my bed by hands invisible, and swiftly borne down the ever-narrowing avenue of time. Each moment I passed a century, and encountered new empires, new peoples, strange ideas, and unknown faiths. So at last I found myself at the end of the avenue, at the end of time, under a blood-red sky more awful than the deepest black. Men and women hurried to and fro, their pale faces reflecting the accursed complexion of the heavens. A desolate silence rested upon all things. Then I heard afar a low wail, indescribably grievous, swelling and falling again, and blending with the notes of the storm that began to rage. The wailing was answered by a groan, and the groaning grew into thunder. The people wrung their hands and tore their hair, and a voice, piercing and persistent, shrieked above the turmoil. "Our Lord and Master, the devil, is no more! Our Lord and Master is no more!" Then I, too, joined the mourners who bewailed the devil's death. An old man came to me and took me by the hand. "You also loved and served him?" he asked. I made no reply, for I knew not wherefore I lamented. He gazed steadfastly into my eyes. "There are no sorrows," he said meaningly, "that are beyond utterance." "Not then like your sorrow," I retorted, "for your eyes are dry, and there is no grief behind your pupils." He placed his finger on my lips and whispered, "Wait." The old man led the way to a vast and lofty hall, filled to the farthest corner with a weeping crowd. The multitude was indeed a mighty one, for all the people of every faith of the world who had worshipped and served the devil were assembled there to do for him the last offices of the dead. I saw there men of my own day, and recognized others of earlier ages, whose faces and fame had been brought down to me by art and by history. And I saw many others who belonged to the later centuries through which I had passed in my night progress down the avenue of time. But as I was about to inquire concerning these, the old man checked me. "Hush," he said, "and listen." And the multitude cried with one voice, "Hark and hear the report of the autopsy." From another apartment there came forth surgeons and physicians and philosophers and learned faculties of all times, charged to examine the devil's body, and to discover, if they could, the mystery of his existence. For, the people had said, if these men of science can tell us wherein the devil was the devil, if they can separate from his mortal parts the immortal principle which distinguished him from ourselves, we may still worship that immortal principle to our own continued profit and to the unending glory of our late Lord and Master. With grave looks upon their countenances, and with reluctant steps, 3 delegates advanced from among the other sages. The old man beside me raised his hand to command perfect silence. Every sound of woe was at the instant suppressed. I saw that one was Galen, Paracelsus another, and Cornelius Agrippa the third. "Ye who have faithfully served the Master," said Agrippa in a loud voice, "must listen in vain for the secret which our scalpels have disclosed. We have laid bare both the heart and the soul of him who lies yonder. His heart was like our hearts, fitly formed to throb with hot passions, to shrink with hatred, and to swell with rage. But the mystery of his soul would blast the lips that uttered it." The old man hurriedly drew me a little way apart, out of the throng. The multitude began to surge and sway with furious wrath. It sought to seize and rend to pieces the learned and venerable men who had dissected the devil. yet refused to publish the mystery of his existence. "What rubbish is this you tell us, you charlatan hackers and hewers of corpses?" exclaimed one. "You have discovered no mystery. You lie to our faces." "Put them to death!" screamed others. "They wish to hoard the secret for their own advantage. We shall presently have a triumvirate of quacks setting themselves up above us, in place of him we have worshipped. For the dignity of his teachings, the ingenuity of his intellect, the exalted character of his morality. To death with these upstart philosophers who would usurp the devil's soul." "We have sought only the truth," replied the men of science soberly. "But we cannot give you the truth as we found it. Our functions go not further." And thereupon they withdrew. "Let us see for ourselves!" shouted the foremost in the angry crowd. So they made their way into the inner apartment where the devil's body lay in state. Thousands pressed after them and struggled in vain to enter the presence of death, that they, too, might discover the true essential quality of the departed. Those who gained entrance reverently but eagerly approached the massive bier of solid gold, studded with glistening stones and resplendent with the mingled luster of the emerald, the chrysolite, and jasper. Dazzled, they shrank back with wild faces and bewildered looks. Not a man among them dared to stretch forth his hand to tear away the bandages and coverings with which the surgeons had veiled their work. Then the old man, who was with me, had silently witnessed the tumultuous scene, drew himself up to a grand height, and said aloud, "Worshippers of the devil, whose majesty even in death holds you subject, it is well that you have not seized the mystery before the time. A variety of signs combine to inspire me with hope that that which has sealed the lips of the men of science may yet be revealed through faith. Let us forthwith pay the last sad tribute to our departed Lord. Let us make to his memory a sacrifice worthy of our devotion. My art can kindle a fire which consumes weighty ingots of gold as readily as it burns tinsel paper, and which leaves behind no ashes and no regrets. Let every man bring hither all the gold, whether in coin or in plate, or in trinkets, that he has earned in serving the devil, and every woman the gold that she has earned, and cast it into the consuming fire. Then will the funeral pyre be worthy of him whom we mourn." "Well said, old man!" cried the devil worshippers. "Thus we will prove that our worship has not been base. Build you the pyre while we go to fetch our gold." My eyes were fixed upon the face of my companion, but I could not read the thoughts that occupied his brain. When I turned again, the vast hall was empty of all save him and me. Slowly and laboriously we built the funeral pile in the center of the apartment. We built it of the costly woods that were at hand, already sprinkled by devout mourners with the choicest spices. We built the pile broad and high, and draped it with gorgeous stuffs. The old man smiled as he prepared the magic fire that was to consume the gold which the devil worshippers had gone to fetch. Within the pyre he left an ample space for their sacrifice. Together we brought forth the devil's body and placed it carefully in position at the top of the pile. Thunders rolled in the lofty space above our heads, and the whole building shook so terribly that I expected it to fall, crushing us between roof and pavement. Crash came after crash of thunder, nearer and nearer to the pyre. Lightnings played across us, around the old man, the devil's corpse, and me. Still we waited for the multitude, but the multitude returned not. "Behold the obsequies," said the old man at last, thrusting his lighted torch into the midst of the pile. "You and I are the only mourners, and we have not a single ounce of gold to offer. Go ye now forth and bid all the devil worshippers to the reading of the last will and testament. They will come." I hastened forth to obey the old man's command, and speedily the funeral hall was thronged again. This time the devil worshippers brought their gold, and every man sought to make excuse for his tardiness at the pyre. The air was thick with explanations. "I tarried only," said one, "to be sure that I had gathered all to the very last piece of gold in my possession." "I fetched," said another, "the laborious accumulations of 50 years, but I cheerfully sacrifice it all to the memory of our dear Lord." A third said, "See, I bring all of mine, even to the wedding ring of my dead wife." There was a contention among the devil worshippers to be first to cast treasure into the fire. The charmed flames caught up the gold and streamed high above the corpse, casting upon every eager face in the vast room a fierce yellow glare. Still the fire was fed by hands innumerable, and still the old man stood by the pyre, smiling strangely. The devil worshippers now cried out with hoarse voices, "The will! The will! Let us hear the last testament of our dead lord!" The old man opened a roll of asbestos paper and began to read aloud, while the hubbub of the great throng died away into silence and the angry roar of the consuming flames subsided into a dull murmur. What the old man read was this: "To my well-beloved subjects, the whole world, my faithful worshippers and loyal servitors, greeting, and the devil's only blessing, a perpetual curse. Forasmuch as I am conscious of the approach of the change that hunts every active existence, yet being of sound mind and firm purpose, I do declare this to be my last will, pleasure, and command, as to the disposal of my kingdom and effects. To the wise I bequeath folly, and to the fools pain. To the rich I leave the wretchedness of the earth, and to the poor the anguish of the unattainable. To the just ingratitude, and to the unjust remorse. And to the theologians I bequeath the ashes of my bones. I decree that the place called hell be closed forever. I decree that the torments in fee simple be divided among all my faithful subjects according to their merit, that the pleasure and the treasure shall also be divided equitably among my subjects." Thereupon the devil worshippers shrieked with one accord, "There is no God but the devil, and he is dead. Now let us enter into our inheritance." But the old man replied, "Ye wretched, the devil is dead, and with the devil died the world. The world is dead." Then they stood aghast, looking at the pyre. All at once the gold-laden flames leaped into a blazing column to the roof and expired. And forth from the red embers of the devil's heart there crept a small snake, hissing hideously. The old man clutched at the snake to crush it, but it slipped through his hands and made its way into the midst of the crowd. Judas Iscariot caught up the snake and placed it in his bosom. And when he did so, the earth beneath us began to quiver as if in the convulsion of death. The lofty pillars of the funeral chamber reeled like giants seized with dizziness. The devil worshippers fell flat upon their faces. The old man and I stood alone. Crash followed quick on crash on every side of us. But it was not this time the concussions of thunder. It was the hopeless sound of the tumbling of man's structures and fabrics, and the echo from the other worlds of this world's crack of doom. Then the stars began to fall, and the fainter lights of heaven came down upon us like a driving sleet of frozen fire. And children died of terror, and mothers clasped their dead babes to their own cold breasts, and hurried this way and that for shelter that was never found. Light became black, fire lost its heat in the utter disorganization of nature, and a whelming flood of chaos surged from the womb of the universe and swallowed up the devil worshippers and their dead world. Then I said to the old man, as we stood in the void, "Now there is surely no evil and no good, no world and no God." But he smiled and shook his head, and left me to wander back unguided through the centuries. Yet as he disappeared, I saw that high over the ruins of the world, a rainbow of infinite brightness stretched its arch.
The Eyes of the Panther by Ambrose Bierce. 1. One does not always marry when insane. A man and a woman, nature had done the grouping, sat on a rustic seat in the late afternoon. The man was middle-aged, slender, swarthy, with the expression of a poet and the complexion of a pirate, a man at whom one would look again. The woman was young, blonde, graceful, with something in her figure and movements suggesting the word lithe. She was habited in a grey gown, with odd brown markings in the texture. She may have been beautiful, one could not readily say, for her eyes denied attention to all else. They were grey-green, long and narrow, with an expression defying analysis. One could only know that they were disquieting. Cleopatra may have had such eyes. The man and the woman talked. "Yes," said the woman, "I love you, God knows, but marry you, no, I cannot, will not." "Irene, you have said that many times, yet always have denied me a reason. I've a right to know, to understand, to feel and prove my fortitude if I have it. Give me a reason." "For loving you?" The woman was smiling through her tears and her pallor. That did not stir any sense of humor in the man. "No, there is no reason for that. A reason for not marrying me. I've a right to know. I must know. I will know." He had risen and was standing before her with clenched hands, on his face a frown. It might have been called a scowl. He looked as if he might attempt to learn by strangling her. She smiled no more, merely sat looking up into his face with a fixed, set regard that was utterly without emotion or sentiment. Yet it had something in it that tamed his resentment and made him shiver. "You are determined to have my reason?" she asked in a tone that was entirely mechanical. A tone that might have been her look made audible. "If you please, if I'm not asking too much." Apparently, this lord of creation was yielding some part of his dominion over his co-creature. "Very well, you shall know. I am insane." The man started, then looked incredulous, and was conscious that he ought to be amused. But again, the sense of humor failed him in his need, and despite his disbelief, he was profoundly disturbed by that which he did not believe. Between our convictions and our feelings there is no good understanding. "That is what the physicians would say," the woman continued, "if they knew. I might myself prefer to call it a case of possession. Sit down and hear what I have to say." The man silently resumed his seat beside her on the rustic bench by the wayside. Over against them on the eastern side of the valley, the hills were already sunset-flushed, and the stillness all about was of that peculiar quality that foretells the twilight. Something of its mysterious and significant solemnity had imparted itself to the man's mood. In the spiritual, as in the material world, are signs and presages of night. Rarely meeting her look, and whenever he did so conscious of the indefinable dread with which, despite their feline beauty, her eyes always affected him, Jenner Brading listened in silence to the story told by Irene Marlowe. In deference to the reader's possible prejudice against the artless method of an unpractised historian, the author ventures to substitute his own version for hers. 2. A room may be too narrow for three, though one is outside. In a little log house containing a single room sparely and rudely furnished, Crouching on the floor against one of the walls was a woman, clasping to her breast a child. Outside, a dense, unbroken forest extended for many miles in every direction. This was at night, and the room was black dark. No human eye could have discerned the woman and the child. Yet they were observed, narrowly, vigilantly, with never even a momentary slackening of attention. And that is the pivotal fact upon which this narrative turns. Charles Marlowe was of the class, now extinct in this country, of woodmen pioneers, men who found their most acceptable surroundings in sylvan solitudes that stretched along the eastern slope of the Mississippi Valley, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. For more than 100 years these men pushed ever westward, generation after generation, with rifle and axe, reclaiming from nature and her savage children here and there an isolated acreage for the plough, no sooner reclaimed than surrendered to their less venturesome but more thrifty successors. At last they burst through the edge of the forest into the open country and vanished as if they had fallen over a cliff. The woodman pioneer is no more, the pioneer of the plains, he whose easy task it was to subdue for occupancy 2/3 of the country in a single generation, is another and inferior creation. With Charles Marlowe in the wilderness, sharing the dangers, hardships, and privations of that strange, unprofitable life, were his wife and child, to whom, in the manner of his class, in which the domestic virtues were a religion, he was passionately attached. The woman was still young enough to be comely, new enough to the awful isolation of her lot to be cheerful, by withholding the large capacity for happiness which the simple satisfactions of the forest life could not have filled. Heaven had dealt honorably with her. In her light household tasks, her child, her husband, and her few foolish books she found abundant provisions for her need. One morning in midsummer, Marlowe took down his rifle from the wooden hooks on the wall, and signified his intention of getting game. "We've meat enough," said his wife. "Please don't go outside today. I dreamed last night. Oh, such a dreadful thing. I cannot recollect it, but I'm almost sure that it will come to pass if you go out." It is painful to confess that Marlowe received this solemn statement with less of gravity than was due to the mysterious nature of the calamity foreshadowed. In truth, he laughed. "Try to remember," he said. "Maybe you dreamed that baby had lost the power of speech." The conjecture was obviously suggested by the fact that baby, clinging to the fringe of his hunting coat with all her 10 pudgy thumbs, was at that moment uttering her sense of the situation in a series of exultant goo-goos inspired by sight of her father's raccoon skin cap. The woman yielded. Lacking the gift of humor, she could not hold out against his kindly badinage. So, with a kiss for the mother and a kiss for the child, he left the house and closed the door upon his happiness forever. At nightfall he had not returned. The woman prepared supper and waited. Then she put baby to bed and sang softly to her until she slept. By this time the fire on the hearth at which she had cooked supper had burned out, and the room was lighted by a single candle. This she afterward placed in the open window as a sign and welcome to the hunter, if he should approach from that side. She had thoughtfully closed and barred the door against such wild animals as might prefer it to an open window. Of the habits of beasts of prey in entering a house uninvited she was not advised, though with true female prevision she may have considered the possibility of their entrance by way of the chimney. As the night wore on she became not less anxious but more drowsy, and at last rested her arms upon the bed by the child and her head upon the arms. The candle in the window burned down to the socket, sputtered and flared a moment, and went out unobserved, for the woman slept and dreamed. In her dreams she sat beside the cradle of a second child. The first one was dead. The father was dead. The home in the forest was lost, and the dwelling in which she lived was unfamiliar. There were heavy oaken doors, always closed, and outside the windows, fastened into the thick stone walls, were iron bars. Obviously, so she thought, a provision against Indians. All this she noted with an infinite self-pity, but without surprise, an emotion unknown in dreams. The child in the cradle was invisible under its coverlet, which something impelled her to remove. She did so, disclosing the face of a wild animal. In the shock of this dreadful revelation, the dreamer awoke, trembling in the darkness of her cabin in the wood. As a sense of her actual surroundings came slowly back to her, she felt for the child that was not a dream, and assured herself by its breathing that all was well with it. Nor could she forbear to pass a hand lightly across its face. Then, moved by some impulse for which she probably could not have accounted, she rose and took the sleeping babe in her arms, holding it close against her breast. The head of the child's cot was against the wall, to which the woman now turned her back as she stood. Lifting her eyes, she saw two bright objects staring the darkness with a reddish-green glow. She took them to be two coals on the hearth, but with her returning sense of direction came the disquieting consciousness that they were not in that quarter of the room, moreover were too high, being nearly at the level of the eyes of her own eyes, for these were the eyes of a panther. The beast was at the open window, directly opposite and not 5 paces away. Nothing but those terrible eyes was visible, but in the dreadful tumult of her feelings, as the situation disclosed itself to her understanding, she somehow knew that the animal was standing on its hinder feet, supporting itself with its paws on the window ledge. That signified a malign interest, not the mere gratification of an indolent curiosity. The consciousness of the attitude was an added horror, accentuating the menace of those awful eyes, in whose steadfast fire her strength and courage were alike consumed. Under their silent questioning she shuddered and turned sick. Her knees failed her, and by degrees, instinctively striving to avoid a sudden movement that might bring the beast upon her, she sank to the floor, crouched against the wall, and tried to shield the babe with her trembling body, without withdrawing her gaze from the luminous orbs that were killing her. No thought of her husband came to her in her agony, no hope nor suggestion of rescue or escape. Her capacity for thought and feeling had narrowed to the dimensions of a single emotion, fear of the animal's spring, of the impact of its body, the buffeting of its great arms, the feel of its teeth in her throat, the mangling of her babe. Motionless now and in absolute silence she waited her doom, the moments growing to hours, to years, to ages, and still those devilish eyes maintained their watch. Returning to his cabin late at night with a deer on his shoulders, Charles Marlowe tried the door. It did not yield. He knocked. There was no answer. He laid down his deer and went round to the window. As he turned the angle of the building, he fancied he heard a sound as of stealthy footfalls and a rustling in the undergrowth of the forest, but they were too slight for certainty, even to his practised ear. Approaching the window, and to his surprise finding it open, he threw his leg over the sill and entered. All was darkness and silence. He groped his way to the fireplace, struck a match, and lit a candle. Then he looked about. Cowering on the floor against a wall was his wife, clasping his child. As he sprang toward her, she rose and broke into laughter, long, loud, and mechanical, devoid of gladness and devoid of sense, the laughter that is not out of keeping with the clanking of a chain. Hardly knowing what he did, he extended his arms. She laid the babe in them. It was dead, pressed to death in its mother's embrace. 3. The theory of the defense. That is what occurred during a night in a forest. But not all of it did Irene Marlowe relate to Jenner Brading. Not all of it was known to her. When she had concluded, the sun was below the horizon, and the long summer twilight had begun to deepen in the hollows of the land. For some moments Brading was silent, expecting the narrative to be carried forward to some definite connection with the conversation introducing it. But the narrator was as silent as he, her face averted, her hands clasping and unclasping themselves as they lay in her lap, with a singular suggestion of an activity independent of her will. "It is a sad, a terrible story," said Brading at last, "but I do not understand. You call Charles Marlowe father, that I know. That he is, old before his time, broken by some great sorrow I have seen or thought I saw. But, pardon me, you said that I am insane?" said the girl without a movement of head or body. "But, Irene, you say, please, dear, do not look away from me. You say that the child was dead, not demented." "Yes, that one. I am the second. I was born 3 months after that night, my mother being mercifully permitted to lay down her life in giving me mine." Brading was again silent. He was a trifle dazed and could not at once think of the right thing to say. Her face was still turned away. In his embarrassment he reached impulsively towards the hands that lay closing and unclosing in her lap. But something, he could not have said what, restrained him. He then remembered vaguely that he had never altogether cared to take her hand. "It is likely," she resumed, "that a person born under such circumstances is like others, is what you call sane." Brading did not reply. He was preoccupied with a new thought that was taking shape in his mind, what a scientist would have called an hypothesis, a detective a theory. It might throw an added light, albeit a lurid one, upon such doubt of her sanity as her own assertion had not dispelled. The country was still new, and outside the villages sparsely populated. The professional hunter was still a familiar figure, and among his trophies were heads and pelts of the larger kind of game. Tales variously credible of nocturnal meetings with savage animals in lonely roads were sometimes current, passed through the customary stages of growth and decay, and were forgotten. A recent addition to these popular apocrypha, originating apparently by spontaneous generation in several households, was of a panther which had frightened some of their members by looking in at windows by night. The yarn had caused its little ripple of excitement, had even attained to the distinction of a place in the local newspaper. But Brading had given it no attention. Its likeness to the story to which he had just listened now impressed him as perhaps more than accidental. Was it not possible that the one story had suggested the other, that finding congenial conditions in a morbid mind and a fertile fancy, it had grown to the tragic tale that he had heard? Brading recalled such circumstances of the girl's history and disposition, of which, with love's incuriosity, he had hitherto been heedless, such as her solitary life with her father, at whose house no one, apparently, was an acceptable visitor, and her strange fear of the night, by which those who knew her best accounted for her never being seen after dark. Surely, in such a mind, imagination once kindled might burn with a lawless flame, penetrating and enveloping the entire structure. That she was mad, though the conviction gave him the acutest pain, he could no longer doubt. She had only mistaken an effect of her mental disorder for its cause, bringing into imaginary relation with her own personality the vagaries of the local myth-makers. With some vague intention of testing his new theory, and no definite notion of how to set about it, he said, gravely but with hesitation, "Irene, dear, tell me, I beg you will not take offence, but tell me." "I have told you," she interrupted, speaking with a passionate earnestness that he had not known her to show. "I have already told you that we cannot marry. Is anything else worth saying?" Before he could stop her, she had sprung from her seat and without another word or look was gliding away among the trees toward her father's house. Brading had risen to detain her. He stood watching her in silence until she had vanished in the gloom. Suddenly he started as if he had been shot. His face took on an expression of amazement and alarm. In one of the black shadows into which she had disappeared, he had caught a quick, brief glimpse of shining eyes. For an instant he was dazed and irresolute. Then he dashed into the wood after her, shouting, "Irene! Irene, look out! The panther! The panther!" In a moment he had passed through the fringe of forest into open ground, and saw the girl's grey skirt vanishing into her father's door. No panther was visible. 4. An appeal to the conscience of God. Jenner Brading, attorney at law, lived in a cottage at the edge of the town. Directly behind the dwelling was the forest. Being a bachelor and therefore, by the draconian moral code of the time and place, denied the services of the only species of domestic servant known thereabout, the hired girl, he boarded at the village hotel, where also was his office. The woodside cottage was merely a lodging maintained at no great cost, to be sure, as an evidence of prosperity and respectability. It would hardly do for one to whom the local newspaper had pointed with pride as the foremost jurist of his time to be homeless, albeit he may sometimes have suspected that the words home and house were not strictly synonymous. Indeed, his consciousness of the disparity and his will to harmonize it were matters of logical inference, for it was generally reported that soon after the cottage was built its owner had made a futile venture in the direction of marriage, had in truth gone so far as to be rejected by the beautiful but eccentric daughter of old man Marlowe, the recluse. This was publicly believed because he had told it himself, and she had not, a reversal of the usual order of things, which could hardly fail to carry conviction. Brading's bedroom was at the rear of the house, with a single window facing the forest. One night he was awakened by a noise at that window. He could hardly have said what it was like. With a little thrill of the nerves he sat up in bed and laid hold of the revolver which, with a forethought most commendable in one addicted to the habit of sleeping on the ground floor with an open window, he had put under his pillow. The room was in absolute darkness, but being unterrified he knew where to direct his eyes, and there he held them, awaiting in silence what further might occur. He could now dimly discern the aperture, a square of lighter black. Presently there appeared at its lower edge two gleaming eyes that burned with a malignant lustre inexpressibly terrible. Brading's heart gave a great jump, then seemed to stand still. A chill passed along his spine and through his hair. He felt the blood forsake his cheeks. He could not have cried out, not to save his life. But being a man of courage, he would not, to save his life, have done so if he had been able. Some trepidation his coward body might feel, but his spirit was of sterner stuff. Slowly the shining eyes rose with a steady motion that seemed an approach, and slowly rose Brading's right hand holding the pistol. He fired. Blinded by the flash and stunned by the report, Brading nevertheless heard, or fancied that he heard, the wild high scream of the panther, so human in sound, so devilish in suggestion. Leaping from the bed, he hastily clothed himself and, pistol in hand, sprang from the door, meeting 2 or 3 men who came running up from the road. A brief explanation was followed by a cautious search of the house. The grass was wet with dew. Beneath the window it had been trodden and partly level for a wide space, from which a devious trail, visible in the light of a lantern, led away into the bushes. One of the men stumbled and fell upon his hands, which as he rose and rubbed them together were slippery. On examination they were seen to be red with blood. An encounter, unarmed, with a wounded panther was not agreeable to their taste. All but Brading turned back. He, with lantern and pistol, pushed courageously forward into the wood. Passing through a difficult undergrowth, he came into a small opening, and there his courage had its reward. There he found the body of his victim, but it was no panther. What it was is told, even to this day, upon a weather-worn headstone in the village churchyard, and for many years was attested daily at the graveside by the bent figure and sorrow-seamed face of old man Marlowe, to whose soul, and to the soul of his strange and happy child, peace, peace and reparation.
An Extraordinary Wedding by Edward Page Mitchell. Professor Daniel Dean Moody of Edinburgh, a gentleman equally well known as a profound psychologist and as an honest and keen-eyed investigator of the phenomena sometimes called spiritualistic, visited this country not many months ago and was entertained in Boston by Dr. Thomas Fullerton at his delightful home on Mount Vernon Street. One evening, when there were present in Dr. Fullerton's parlors, besides himself and his Scotch guest, Dr. Curtis of the Medical School of the Boston University, the Reverend Dr. Amos Cutler of the Lind Street Church, Mr. Magnus of West Newton, three ladies, and the writer, the conversation turned to subjects of an occult character. "There once lived in Aberdeen," said Professor Moody, "a medium named Jenny McGraw, of slender intellectuality, but of remarkable psychic strength. 200 years ago, you good people of Boston would have hanged Jenny for a witch. I have seen in her cottage materialization for which I could not and cannot account by any hypothesis of deception or of hallucination. I have seen forms come forth, not from any cabinet or trick closet, but extruded before my eyes from the person of Jenny herself, hanging nebulous in the air for a moment, and then slowly taking corporate shape. That there was no vulgar trick about this, I am willing to stake my scientific reputation. One night Plato himself, or an eidolon claiming to be Plato, emerged from Jenny McGraw's bosom and conversed with me for full 15 minutes upon the duality of the idea, the medium, in the meanwhile, remaining entranced." Dr. Fullerton exchanged a significant glance with his wife. Their guest intercepted it and said, "You don't believe me? No wonder." "Not that," rejoined Dr. Fullerton. "Your testimony as a scientific observer is worthy of all possible respect. But what became of Jenny McGraw?" "She was a dull, unsympathetic young woman, hardly to be classed as a rational being. So far from becoming interested in these wonderful manifestations exhibited through her organization, she was excessively annoyed by them, and I believe she finally left Scotland to escape the troublesome spirits and the still more troublesome mortals who flocked to her cottage and sadly interfered with her washing, ironing, and baking." "A Yankee girl," said Mr. Magnus, "would have turned such powers to account and have made her fortune." "Jenny McGraw," replied Professor Moody, "whom I believe to be the only medium in the world capable of producing materializations in the broad light, and independently of her surroundings, was thrifty enough, like all Scotchwomen, but she hadn't the intelligence to recognize the opportunity. She was frequently advised to go before the public. Advice is wasted on the Scotch. I don't know where she is at present." Dr. Fullerton again glanced at his wife. Mrs. Fullerton rose and touched a bell. The door soon opened, and there appeared a lumpy, red-haired domestic, who curtsied awkwardly as she entered the room. "Did you ring, ma'am?" she asked. "Jenny," said Mrs. Fullerton, "here is an old friend of yours from Scotland." The girl showed no sign of surprise. Scarcely a shade of recognition passed over her stupid countenance as she walked sullenly up to the professor and sullenly took his extended hand. "I didna ken ye was come to America, Maister Moody," she said, and looked around as if she would be glad to escape the learned company. "Now, with your permission, Mrs. Fullerton," said the professor, looking over Jenny McGraw's shoulder toward his hostess. "We will ask the young woman if she will kindly assist us in an investigation which we purpose to make." Jenny looked up suspiciously and turned her small, dull eyes from her master to her mistress, and from her mistress to the door. "I'm not over fond of sick investigating," she stolidly remarked, "and it gives me a pain in the breast to bring out the old ghosts, as ye no doubt remember wull, Mr. Woody." For a long time the girl stubbornly refused to renew her relations with the mysterious yonder. I have forgotten what argument or plea it was that at last won her to a reluctant consent. I have not forgotten what followed. The room was as light as the full blaze of 5 gas jets could make it. Under this blaze, and surrounded by the partly amused, partly skeptical company, Jenny was seated in a Turkish easy-chair. She did not form an attractive picture, short, squat, sandy, freckled, and peevish-eyed as she was. "Good Lord," I whispered to a neighbor, "do glorified spirits choose such a channel as that when they wish to come back to us?" "Hush!" said Professor Moody. "The girl is passing into a trance." The swinish eyes opened and closed. A sluggish convulsion fluttered across the flabby cheeks. A sigh or two, a nervous twitching of her chair, breathing heavily. "Ineffectually simulated coma," whispered Dr. Curtis to me. "And not the work of an artist. This is a farce." For 15 or 20 minutes we sat in patience, the stillness broken only by the rough respiration of the girl. Then one or two of the party began to yawn, and the hostess, fearing that the experiment was becoming a bore, moved as if to break up the circle. But Professor Moody raised his hand in protest. But before he dropped it, he made a rapid gesture which directed all our eyes toward Jenny McGraw. Her head and bust seemed to be enveloped in a dim, thin film of opalescent vapor, which floated free about her, yet was fixed at one point, as a wreath of blue smoke hangs at the end of a good cigar. The point of attachment appeared to be in the neighborhood of Jenny's heart. She had stopped breathing loudly, and was as pale as the dead, but her face was no whiter than that of Dr. Curtis. I felt his hand groping for mine. He found it and clutched it till it was numb. While we watched, the vapor that proceeded from Jenny's bosom grew in volume and became opaque. It was like a dark, well-defined cloud, floating before our eyes, here gathering itself in and extending itself there, till at last the shape was perfect. You have seen a dim, meaningless object under a lens gradually define itself as it was brought into focus and suddenly stand out clear and sharp. Or better, you have seen at a shadow pantomime a vague, amorphous cloudiness intensify and take shape as the person approached the screen, until it became a perfect silhouette. Now imagine the silhouette stepping forth into your presence, a solidified fact, and you get some idea of the marvelous transition by which this shadow from a world we know not of stepped forth into the midst of our little company. I looked across the room at the Reverend Dr. Cutler. He was clasping his forehead with both hands. I have never seen a more striking picture of mingled horror, terror, and perplexity. The newcomer was a man of 28 or 30, of fine features and dignified bearing. He made a courteous bow to the assemblage, but when he saw that Professor Moody was about to speak, put his finger to his lips and glanced back uneasily at the medium. I fancied that an expression of disgust stole over his handsome countenance when he perceived how unlovely was the gateway through which he had returned to earth. Nevertheless, he kept his eyes fixed upon Jenny McGraw's pallid face, and folded his arms as if waiting. We were now thoroughly under the spell of this mysterious happening. With eager expectation, but without surprise, we saw again the phenomena of the cloud, the shadow, the concentration, and the presence. Slowly out of the white mist and nebulous shadow there took form the most beautiful woman that mortal eyes ever beheld. It was a woman, a living, breathing woman. Her magnificent lips slightly parted, her bosom rising and falling beneath a garment of wonderfully woven texture, her glorious black eyes shining upon us till our heads swam and our thoughts reeled. It would be easier to fathom the secret of her being than to describe the unearthly beauty that startled and awed us. The first comer unfolded his arms, and with the tenderness of a lover and the deference due a queen, took the shapely white hand of the marvelous lady and led her forth to the middle of the room. She said no word, but suffered herself to be guided by his hand, and stood like an empress, scanning our faces and habiliments with a puzzled curiosity in which it was possible to detect the slightest trace of disdain. He spoke at last in a low voice. "Friends," he slowly said, "a great love carried one who was lately a mortal into the presence of a goddess. A greater good fortune befell him than his small sacrifices had earned. I cannot speak more plainly. Hear our entreaty and grant it without questioning. There is here a servant of the Church, duly qualified to pronounce the only words that can crown a love like mine. That love reached back over centuries to meet its object, and was sealed by a willing death. We come from another world to ask to be joined in wedlock, according to the forms of this world." Strange as it may seem, the preceding events had so attuned our consciousness to the spirit of the surroundings that we heard this extraordinary speech without amazement, and when Mr. Magnus of West Newton, who would preserve his cool matter-of-fact manner in the company of archangels, audibly whispered, "Eloped, by Jove, from the spirit land!" his words jarred harshly in our ears. The Reverend Dr. Amos Cutler displayed most strikingly the effect of the glamour that had been thrown over our 19th century common sense. That pious man rose from his chair with a dazed and helpless look in his face, and, like one walking in his sleep, advanced toward the couple. Raising his hand to command silence, he solemnly and deliberately asked the questions that, by usage of the Church, are preliminary to the marriage rite. The man responded in a clear, triumphant tone. The bride answered only by a slight inclination of her beautiful head. "Then," declared Dr. Cutler, "in the presence of these witnesses, I pronounce you man and wife. And God forgive me," he added, "for lending myself to the devil's works by the sacrilege of this act." One by one, we passed up to take the bridegroom's hand and salute the bride. His hand was like the hand of a marble statue, but a radiant smile brightened his face. At a whispered suggestion from him, she bent her regal head and allowed each one of us to kiss her cheek. It was soft and blood-warm. When Dr. Cutler saluted her, she smiled for the first time, and with a rapid, graceful movement detached from her black hair a great pearl and put it in his hand. He gazed at it a moment, and then, on a sudden impulse, flung it into the open grate. In the hot blaze, Dr. Cutler's wedding fee whitened, calcined, crumbled, and disappeared. Then the bridegroom led his wife back to the chair where the medium still sat entranced. He clasped her close in his arms, their melting forms interblended in shadowy vapor, and, fading slowly away, this newly married couple found their nuptial pillow in the bosom of Jenny McGraw. 2. One day after Professor Moody had left Boston, I went to the Athenaeum Library in search of certain facts and dates regarding the Franco-Prussian War. While turning over the leaves of a bound file of the London Daily News for 1871, my eyes happened to fall upon the following paragraph. "The Vienna Free Press says that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of July 12, a young man of good appearance shot himself through the heart in the east corridor of the Imperial Gallery. It was at the hour of closing the gallery, and the young man had been warned by an attendant that he must depart. He was standing motionless before Herr Hans Mackhart's fine picture of Cleopatra's barge, and paid no heed to the admonition. When it was repeated more emphatically, he pointed in an absent manner to the painting, and having remarked, "Is not that a woman worth dying for?" drew a pistol and fired with fatal effect. There is no clue to the suicide's individuality except that afforded at the Golden Lamb Hotel, where he was registered simply as Cotton. He had been in Vienna several weeks, had spent money freely, and had frequently been observed at the Imperial Gallery, always before this picture of Cleopatra. The unfortunate youth is believed to have been insane. I made a careful copy of this brief story and sent it, without comment, to the Reverend Dr. Cutler. A day or two later he returned it with a note. "The events of that night at Dr. Fullerton's," he wrote, "are to me as the events of a dimly remembered dream. Pardon me if I say that it will be a kindness to let me forget them altogether."